So now I'm going to explain what exactly is the open source movement and how does that relate to the free software movement. There seems to be a lot of confusion out there on what the two different movements are. I made a speech about why the open source movement and the free software movement are incompatible. They cannot be mixed and you cannot support both of them. And people are still confused by what I mean. They don't seem to quite be on the same page as me. So with this speech I intend to clear all the confusion out there. I'm going to explain the origins and the purpose and the function of the open source movement as it relates to the free software movement, and why some people might support one or the other for whatever reasons. So right, let's get into it. So I'm gonna start with a brief introduction of the free software movement. And the free software movement, because it happened chronologically before the open source movement and it is relevant to the birth of the open source movement, that's why I will explain the free software movement first. The free software movement, on a fundamental philosophical basis, has its origins in the fact that back in the very old days of computer science, in the universities and whatever, that were those institutions where computers were a thing, there would have been these people who called themselves the hackers, and they had a culture of sharing software. They would all in that university or whatever, they would all share all the softwares with each other. There was a culture of sharing. They did that sort of thing. And also lots of other software around that time period would have been free software, even just generic software publicly distributed out there. So there was more precedent in that time period, in the early days of computer science, for sharing software. So out of this environment came Richard Stallman, who himself was one of these hackers, and then he started seeing that more and more the world was going into a direction where proprietary software was getting more and more prevalent. So he saw that these communities of sharing software were dying out, and they were replaced by this widespread distribution of proprietary software, and he didn't like that. So what he did is that he started a social movement to promote software freedom and the liberation of cyberspace. And what that means is that the free software movement is fundamentally about this idea of the freedom in computing, where what Richard Stallman was seeing is that the proprietary software, as it became widespread, and he saw it as something that subjugates the user, where because of the proprietary software has the licenses, the terms of service, or whatever you want to call them, that restrict the user's freedoms in what they can do. He saw that as unjust, where this culture of sharing that existed previously, in that everyone was free to do whatever with the software. And he basically just saw the emergence of proprietary software as an injustice and wanted to rid the world of it. So that's the origins of the free software movement. And I will also mention what the free software movement is specifically. What is free software? Well, free software is then software that respects the user's freedom. This is accomplished by granting the users the 4 freedoms that Richard Stallman defined. Freedom number 0 is the freedom to use the software for whatever purpose. Anyone can use it. There can be no limitations on who can use the software. It's for everyone. Everyone can use it for whatever purpose. Freedom number 1 is the freedom to study and make changes to the software. This requires the source code, because without the source code, binary compiled programs are just mysterious numbers, so it is not a reasonable thing to ask of a person to just modify the numbers, it is a mockery of software freedom only to grant them the right to modify the binaries but not give them the source code. So therefore a source code is a prerequisite. So that is to meaningfully modify the software. So this means that the user has the freedom to make changes to the software. This is so that the user can do whatever they want with the software, in the sense that if the software doesn't do what the user wants it to do already, then the user can go ahead and modify it to make it do what the user wants. And this gives each user individual control. These two freedoms so far, they give each user individual control. This means that each individual user has the freedom to do whatever they want with the software on a personal basis. However, what about a person in a community who is not a programmer? Well, that person doesn't know how to program. So what everyone needs, therefore, is the freedom, the two other freedoms. Freedom number 2 is for every user to have the right to share exact copies of the software. This promotes the culture of sharing. That is good. And then finally, the freedom number 3 is the freedom to distribute modified copies. This is so that those people in a community who don't know how to do programming and all that, they can benefit from changes made to the software. If they cannot change the software themselves because they are not a programmer, they need someone else to do the changes for them. So they can go ahead and ask another member of their community to make those changes. If necessary, they can ask for payment, the ones who do the modifications. So the distribution of the software can also be done for charging money. And so yeah, that's the 4 freedoms, and that's what free software is. So now I'm going to get to the open source idea. So I'm going to start with the reasoning for why the open source became a thing. Because the values of freedom that the free software movement promotes inherently, they are going to make people who are in certain positions uncomfortable, because talking about moral and ethical questions is seen as something that people do not generally like, perhaps, to some extent, some people. So the idea is that ethical questions make some people feel uncomfortable. So therefore, the open source movement was conceived as an attempt to disguise the free software movement under different branding that erases all of those ethical questions and merely talks about some practical advantages that the software may have, due to the ability of the community to develop the software. That basically creates this environment where it is almost like crowdfunding the development of the software, where, because the members of the community can develop the software, it is a more efficient and better way to develop software in practical terms. They took that idea of the practical benefits, and gave that as the sole reason as to why the quote open source unquote idea should be promoted. And that was done specifically with the purpose that the companies and like corporations that were used to promoting proprietary software and all that, and other entities I suppose also, but primarily the corporations would adopt the open source idea, because when the open source idea does not talk about the ethics, that it doesn't make the company people feel uncomfortable. So that's the initial reasoning why the open source became a thing. But here's the thing, even if it was initially an attempt at disguising the free software movement under different branding, because it created this environment where people are pushing for the use of software now for different reasons than freedom, because they weren't actually promoting freedom, even if hypothetically a person who secretly believes in the free software movement but promotes the software under different branding, they were in practice promoting a different movement. They created a different movement out of it. So the open source movement became a thing of its own that is independent of the free software movement. So initially, although the open source movement was started out as a way to promote the free software movement under different branding, it is no longer tied to the free software movement because of this fact that it erases those values of freedom. And then people who heard about the open source movement, who never heard about the values of freedom, because open source doesn't talk about freedom, they then from there went on to promote open source further, and they never talked about freedom. And so with this, as more and more generations of computer users go along, the values of freedom and such basically disappear out of the open source movement itself. So the open source movement it's no longer about promoting free software disguised as, or rather, that's not the correct way to put it. It is no longer about software freedom. It is no longer about liberation of cyberspace that Richard Stallman wanted. It's no longer about that. Open source became a movement of its own because the fact that it took away the values of freedom that the free software movement talks about and are fundamentally driven off of, the free software movement is specifically built on the values of freedom and the community. So because the open source movement rids itself out of the freedoms that the free software movement has, it became a different movement. So now we have two different movements out there in the world. There is the free software movement that has the goal to liberate the cyberspace, which means that their ultimate goal is to rid the world of proprietary software, because they see proprietary software as evil. It is a moral injustice. It is something that should not exist. Richard Stallman's goal was to make all software free. And that is still what the goal of the free software movement is. The purpose and what the liberation of cyberspace means is that all the computer users can do their computing in freedom. That's what the liberation of cyberspace means. Everything that a person does on a computer can be done in freedom. Never will the user encounter a proprietary thing when they are using the computer. That's what the liberation of cyberspace entails. So I have now explained the difference between the two movements and their origins. So I will mention about the software. I talked about in the previous speech on the topic that the software can be seen as both meeting the definition of being open source and being also free software. Well, what's that about? Well, you see, like I talked about, the open source movement inherently supports the same software, basically. The software is the same, but the reason the movements promote the use of the software is different. You see, the software itself is just software. It is not a part of any movement, but a person that promotes the software, a person that tells other people to use the software, they have reasons they do what they do. And between the two different movements, the free software movement and the open source movement, the people who are members of those movements, they have different reasons they promote the software between the movements. So a person who is a member of the free software movement will promote the software because they value freedom and they want other people to have freedom in their computing. But a person from the open source movement will talk about the practical advantages of the software. Right, so that's the movements. Next I'm going to discuss weird ideas like, quote, mixing between the movements, unquote. Now, the speech I already mentioned, the earlier speech about the topic, where I explained that a person cannot be a supporter of both of the two movements and that they are incompatible. I stand by everything I said in that movement, but some people seem to have still been left confused, so I will now try to explain the similar thing from different points of view. Perhaps I will use different examples and try to clarify the position that I have, because some people just didn't seem to understand what I was going on about. So I will now try to explain why a person might support one thing and say another, perhaps, and what the mixing of the movements might actually be in the real world. Well, you see, I have now explained the difference of the two movements, why they are different. Well, I just now gave the example just a few moments ago, where why would the two different persons support the software or tell other people to use the software? Well, what about the mixing of the movements? Well, here's the thing. Like I mentioned or talked about, explained, the open source movement was indeed initially started as a disguise to promote the free software. So there might still be lots of those sorts of old school open source people out there who are really members of the free software movement secretly, but they just promote the movement under the terminology, quote, open source, unquote. So those are the old school open source people who are from the initial open source idea, the founding conception of it. But to those people I say, that's a stupid idea. The open source movement itself was started for a stupid reason. I say the open source movement should have never been created in the first place. You see, people who promote freedom, or rather people who want to promote freedom, people who believe in freedom, people who align with the values of the free software movement, I say they should support the free software movement. I say they should promote the free software movement, as it is, by its own name. I say the open source movement itself was started for stupid reasons. This idea that the free software movement needs to be disguised to avoid the ethical questions, so that some people don't feel uncomfortable. That is a stupid reason to start a different movement. That is nonsense. So I disagree with the open source movement from the start. It exists for bad reasons. People who align with the free software movement should just say free software. They should promote the free software movement. So those people who I call the old school open source promoters, those people, I tell them, just stop doing what you're doing. Please promote the free software movement instead, because the open source idea itself is flawed from the beginning. So that's those people. And then what about other people today who might talk about some open source things, mixing between the movement things, whatever? Well, lots of those people are just confused. Because, like I just now explained, the open source movement was initially started off as a derivative of the free software movement. So naturally it does take some cultural similarities from there. And there are going to be lots of similarities, and there is this appearance of compatibility. Because, like I've talked about, they do promote the same software. The same exact piece of software can qualify as being free software and open source software at the same time. So this appearance of compatibility between the two movements makes some people get confused. And then also, of course, there are going to be inevitably those people out there who have the same views and feel the same way about the fact that the ethical questions make people feel uncomfortable. The same reasons that led to the open source movement being started in the first place. Those sorts of people, of course, even if they somewhat value free software, they might themselves even feel uncomfortable with the questions of free software to some extent, which creates this weird cognitive dissonance things, I imagine. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but I imagine that's what people might be doing, because Well, I mean, I'm just guessing really, but that might be what might be going on there. So that might be some mixing between the movements right there. And then, of course, there's the example I already mentioned earlier in the previous speech, that people who just are supporters of the open source movement, who don't care about freedom at all whatsoever, they might say that they support free software even if they don't, just to put on the illusion that they are supporters. No, facade. Put on the facade that they support both of the movements. And that's an attempt at co-opting the people, the discussion around the software, to make people who would otherwise be supporters of the free software movement go along with them. You see, because the two movements are different movements, there's the open source movement and there's the free software movement. And because they talk about the same software, the open source movement wants to steal the audience of the free software movement. And so they are going to put on the facade that the two movements are compatible, and hence the open source movement can just go and pick up some supporters of the free software movement to join this open source movement instead. Just telling them that you can support both of them. But really I say you can't. So that's that, and then let's see, would there be other groups of people still? Yeah, well, I mean, I guess there's inevitably going to be those people who are just genuinely confused and they don't understand the difference between the movements. So, for example, there could be people who support philosophically the free software movement. Their philosophical beliefs and their ethical code and their moral views, they all align with the free software movement. So really they should be promoters of the free software movement. But because they've heard that everyone calls the software open source, therefore they just use that terminology. So they are really at their core, they are supporters of the free software movement. Or actually, they are all the way supporters of the free software movement. However, they just call it by the wrong name. So those people who are actually philosophically all the way aligned with the free software movement and just call it by the wrong name, well, that might also create the illusion of mixing between the movements. Because, well, the outward appearance of that is that that person is supporting both of the movements. So, yeah, that's just a confused person who doesn't know what they are supporting. Maybe they've just heard everyone call the software open source and that's why they say that. Where really their values actually align with the free software movement. It could go the other way around too, where someone who actually supports the open source movement but doesn't care about freedom might call the software free software, for whatever reason. I think that might be less rare, however, because like I've mentioned, lots of people feel uncomfortable about the ethics, and if that person is not driven by the ethics, then it would be strange to call it free software, so I think that's less likely. But I suppose it's possible. But I don't think that many people would be in that camp. Yeah, that seems like it's a very few people at most, I suppose. But anyway, one of the biggest groups I think might be those people who are actually philosophically aligned with the free software movement all the way, except they just call it by the wrong name. Also, another big group of people would be those who are the open source supporters who want to put on the appearance as if they support the free software movement. This is to get those people who are confused about the naming, who would otherwise support free software, but because they hear it called open source, they would then go along with open source people who actually don't care about software freedom. So again, to explain this with an example, there are two persons, person A and person B. Person A supports open source and they believe in open source, but they say that it is also free software. That's what they say. But I say that's nonsense, but that's what they say. And then there's person B who believes philosophically all the way in every area. They support the free software movement philosophically, but they are confused about the naming. And they have been told this idea of mixing between the movements. And then, now this person B, goes along with whatever the person A wants them to do. Because the person A, who is a supporter of the open source movement, wants all the people to go along with what this person wants. The person A. The person A wants everyone to do what this person wants. So, Per wants, yeah. Person A wants everyone to do what Per wants. So, they want to have all those would-be free software movement promoters to go along with them. Right, so that's the sort of scenario I can imagine where this illusion of mixing between the movements is created. Yeah, so there is no mixing between the movements. It's a lie. It's a lie open source promoters tell to try to steal the audience from the free software movement, to get them to go along with open source. The supporters of open source, they say that the two movements can be mixed. But really what they are doing is they are just getting those people who would otherwise support the free software movement to go along with the open source movement instead. To make them stop supporting the free software movement and support the open source movement instead. They just say that, well, by supporting the open source movement, you are supporting the free software movement. That's what they say. But really, you are not supporting the free software movement by supporting the open source movement, is what I say. For the very reason that the open source movement is no longer about freedom. It hasn't been for a long time. It may have been initially conceived as a disguise to make the free software movement appear less uncomfortable to some people. But that might have been the original reason it was started, but it's no longer what the open source movement is. It became its own thing. That disguise became the movement. You see, that's what happened. So, it's no longer just free software with a different branding. That different branding is now the movement. So that branding of let's avoid the ethical questions now is the open source movement. Where the free software movement wants to rid the world of proprietary software to make all software free, the open source movement does not want that. People who believe in the open source movement and who don't believe in the free software movement, they don't want to erase proprietary software off the face of Earth. They are perfectly fine with proprietary software existing. Take notable big name famous supporters of open source movement as an example. Linus Torvalds is a very famous supporter of the open source movement over the free software movement. He has said many times that he disagrees with the free software movement. And he has said that he's fine with proprietary software existing, and he might even make some himself. He wouldn't have any issue with it. He doesn't take any issue with proprietary software. That's what Linus Torvalds says, as a supporter of the open source movement. He doesn't even put on the facade that he's supporting the free software movement, like many supporters of the open source movement do. He just goes 100% with the open source movement. And that's the position that all the open source movement people actually have. Even if they say they support the free software movement, they are lying. Because open source movement peoples who say they support the free software movement are liars. That, or they are just confused people who are mistakenly seeing themselves as open source, even if they are actually not. So those people are just confused. But people who actually truly believe in the open source idea, and they know what they believe in, if they say they support the free software movement, they are lying to you. But Linus Torvalds wasn't one of those liars. He just said what the open source movement actually believes. There is nothing wrong with proprietary software, he says. He might even make some himself, he says. Now that's what the open source movement stands for. If the open source movement is all there is, then proprietary software is never going to go away. The reason Linus Torvalds supports the open source movement is because that's what he sees as the best way to develop the software. It is a technical reason. You see, Linus Torvalds wants you to give the contribution, the source code changes. He wants the development of the software. So he's a supporter of the open source movement. That's what it means. Linus Torvalds is basically the prime example of the open source movement. He wants the people to make their source code available so that the technology can advance. It's a technological reason, not an ethical one. Linus Torvalds does not care about the freedom of computer users. He just wants the source code changes be given to him so that he can develop the kernel better. That's the reason. That's what open source is. Where then if you go to Richard Stallman, the reason Richard Stallman supports the free software movement is because he wants to liberate the cyberspace. He wants computer users to have freedom. These two are different movements, and these viewpoints are incompatible. You cannot agree with Linus Torvalds at the same time when you agree with Richard Stallman. That just makes no sense to agree with both of them. And if you think you can agree with both of them, then you are so stupid. Like, genuinely, like, you just have some screw loose in your head. Because those two are incompatible. Linus Torvalds says that proprietary software is fine. Richard Stallman says proprietary software is evil. You can't support the two of them. That's why you cannot be a supporter of the open source movement at the same time you are a supporter of the free software movement. Because they believe in two different things that are incompatible. That's why. It's not a difficult concept to understand. So, yeah, people are so stupid or confused. Not everyone who is wrong is always stupid. So yeah, I might sometimes exaggerate a little, but people are really just confused. Yeah, mistaken. Yeah, people do make mistakes and are confused. So I hope that this speech clears the misunderstanding. But for those who still don't understand, well, they are so stupid. Like, at this point, if you don't understand it, like, I'm pretty sure I explained this pretty well, so if you still don't understand, then you're so stupid. I repeat again. Linus Torvalds says proprietary software is fine. He supports the open source movement. Richard Stallman says proprietary software is evil. He supports the free software movement. And I say the two are perfect examples of the movements. So yeah, those two movements are incompatible. Now you could make the argument that, oh, Linus Torvalds does not represent the open source movement. But I say he does. I say he's a perfect example of what open source stands for. So yeah, your argument would be wrong. Anyway, yeah, that's that for this speech. Thanks for listening. Until next time, bye.